I'm Sarah Russell.
I'm JQ Walker.
I'm Hind, and we are
The Neurodivergent Report, a research-based podcast by and for neurodivergent brains.
In each episode, we'll explore topics relating to neurodiversity and coping strategies by reviewing the literature and discussing current topics.
We will also have interview episodes where we sit down with experts in the field and listeners like you, with the hope that together we can all learn to heal in community.
However you are able to engage, thank you for being here. I've been thinking about frogs today.
Yeah,
Did you see that bit of news that I'm referring to?
in Portland, we talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah. I really like they did an interview with him and they were talking about the quote about, and just to quote it, I guess verbatim would be, he was talking about by appearing so ridiculous, it highlights how ridiculous the situation is, which I think is a really interesting way of approaching it. Yeah. How do
Yes.
you make yourself appear as non-threatening as possible?
Yeah, so actually, I have this book called On Tyranny, and it does
Mhm.
discuss that. I don't remember where in the book it is, so I'll just read it for you right now. I'll let you see. Yeah, and it basically just says, stand out, someone has to. The moment you set an example, the spell of the status quo is broken and others will follow.
Yeah, I like that. That's a really good way of framing it, and I kind of, yeah, in some ways is something I want to talk about a little bit today. So it's
I
about how to
love
make
that.
changes and differences. Because I know when we originally kind of spoke, I was like, oh, I want to talk a little bit about like critical thinking and clinical practice. But as I started thinking about it, because I was like, okay, well, how to reflect on my own experience as being a neurodivergent person in the world, started doing a lot of research into like workplace challenges and how to reconceptualize neurodiversity in the workplace. So,
Snowball.
yeah,
Yeah, awesome. Well, who are you?
who am
You're
I?
Matt.
I'm
Matt
yeah,
Seneshen. I have to
correct.
really slow it down to hit all those syllables. Anyway, so Matt, you
Mhm.
are a Canadian who
Correct.
currently lives in Australia. And that really threw me for a loop the first time we had a chat because I was expecting that, like, good old-fashioned Aussie accent. And I met with you instead. And
Yeah.
actually, it's really funny because you have sort of what I would call a waspy accent, not even traditional Canadian.
No, it's pretty mild. I actually went to an international school in Indonesia for 2.5 years, which was staffed mainly by American teachers. So I would say I had a pretty broad American accent, like sort of North American accent as opposed to English.
Wow, we didn't even hit that in the pre-chat. Incredible piece of knowledge. It just calls into question previous episodes that I've done. I spoke with this man named Sean, and he's of Indian descent, but his parents raised him very waspy, his words, because they didn't want the discrimination that their older daughter had faced when they moved to the US.
Yeah, that actually.
Anyway, sorry, I'm going off talking about accents, but
No, I was going to say that you're spot on because my surname, for example, is Ukrainian. So my great grandfather came from Ukraine around the turn of the century, and the reason I don't speak Russian and Ukrainian today was because my grandfather elected not to teach my father because of the discrimination that Ukrainians were facing in Canada at the time. So you've pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of it being this aspect of assimilation as opposed to integration at times, about shedding one culture in favor of adopting another.
Mhm.
Oh,
Really fitting for Indigenous Peoples Day here in the States.
there you go. Didn't know that was the day. But to answer your original question, to introduce myself a little bit, so people know who I am and why they want to listen to me waffle on about these things for the next hour or so. So I'm a certified clinical counselor here in Australia. And I'm a clinical educator, so I teach new therapists at postgraduate level. Been doing that for a few years now, coming on 4 years. But then I've been practicing in the mental health sector for about 7 years. And just to very, very concisely summarize my experience, most of the time I've been focusing on supporting young adults as well as adolescents in both community, in school, as well as university, as well as in outreach settings as well. So that's where most of my experience is going to be derived on today. And then talk about a little bit myself as more of a neurodivergent, neurodiverse person, or neuroatypical person, however you want to frame it or label it. To go back to what I was talking about before about living in Indonesia for 2 years. So when I was in Indonesia, that's where I got my first sort of assessment. So I was actually reading the report a few days ago. Never actually read it before. It was actually a bit of an emotional experience rereading it. But the first time I was diagnosed with having developmental written language disorder, dysgraphia, as well as developmental variations across phonological processing, motor process areas, as well as visual spatial processing and attention. I don't quite have a formal diagnosis of ADHD, but I do have noted issues with attention and impulsivity related to fatigue and visual. So
And
that's
so
a very
many
specific.
processing differences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very unique to each individual. It's the variation that can occur across
Mm.
individuation. And then also throughout my lifespan, I've also struggled with hypermobility spectrum disorder, which I was diagnosed 4 years ago, which, yeah, struggled with a lot when I was younger. But now that I'm older and I've developed fairly strict routines around physiotherapy and exercise, it hasn't impacted me as much. But there is definitely a relationship with that, especially with motor praxis. And hypermobility.
It's really interesting because I've never met a man who said, I have hypermobility disorder. And
Mm.
I have suspicions of my own brother. I mean, he's always had like muscle man physique. And I've wondered if that was like to compensate for the bad joints or
Yeah,
like he would never even know.
yeah, absolutely. And I
So,
think the biggest time of where it comes into play with men is either when they're doing excessive exercise. So with my father, for example, he struggled with dislocations probably primarily as a result of doing kung fu and MMA when he was younger. And then with my brother, it was, yeah, just physical exercise outdoors when he struggled with his knees in general. So it's, yeah, I think you're
interesting.
exactly right. It's saying it's probably muscle mass and tendon strength. It probably is variations across the genders.
Yeah. Oh, so the last time we were speaking, right, that's right. We were talking about dysgraphia, and then I think I asked you a lot of really invasive questions about your dysgraphia diagnosis.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. But let's talk a little bit about your childhood experience that led you to diagnosis. So you said you were first assessed in Indonesia.
Yeah, at age 9.
What
So I
was
was
that
going.
experience like?
Well, I mean, don't remember too clearly.
Okay.
I
I
honestly
have
thought it
nothing to
happened in
compare it to.
Australia because I think we moved to Australia about a year and a half later. But I do remember distinctly having kind of experiences of being in a classroom and trying to complete a piece of work, especially with
Mm.
writing, and just have it not be good enough for people to read or for people to understand, or yeah, just trying to be able to produce it and not being able to demonstrate my level of understanding about the topic and getting really frustrated by it. And it wasn't until someone actually sort of said, oh, hey, maybe he needs to be assessed for something, that it kind of in some ways made me feel incapable, I suppose, because it gave me a pathway out from feeling kind of stuck, kind of being trapped a little bit in terms of my like fine motor skills. Because when I was able to get trained a little bit more in terms of like my keyboarding skills and using the computer as a way of writing, it pretty much eliminated that barrier a lot. And I found it like a great relief to myself being able to get that accommodation when I was in school to be able to use a laptop in class, because it meant that I was really able to demonstrate and to be able to articulate myself. And it didn't feel like my body or my brain was in some ways a barrier between myself and other people and being understood by other people. So it was a very helpful experience, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like it would have afforded you a lot of self-compassion.
Yeah, that's a
In
good way of putting
teenage
it.
Which it sounds like it came at just the right time because everybody needs more self-compassion in those, like, teen, adolescent, very formative, emotional
Years, yeah, you're
times,
exactly
yeah.
right, it was kind of it was a difficult experience for me in school in general, but once I left school and I went to university, definitely everything kind of changed for me, and that's where I kind of found my stride, I suppose, in life.
Mm,
But that initial kind of experience and being able to get key supports identified and key accommodations, I think was a really key aspect to me, uh, which I suppose in some ways leads into sort of one of the topics I wanted
why
to kind of talk about today, which was
amazing segue.
is talking a little bit about workplace and navigating the workplace as someone who's neurodiverse. So the reason I kind of bring this up is it's this is one of sort of the key difficulties I suppose that I've experienced myself, as well as something that I've supported people through both as a supervisor at work, as well as a counselor, helping someone navigate a workplace as someone who's neurodiverse, because it ends up being one of the key areas that I support clients with in my practice, as well as it forms a lot of the basis of counseling goals with people. Because today in our society, we're often really kind of hyper focused on productivity and belonging because work takes a large portion of our day to day lives. But before I go any further, I just want to make a bit of a disclaimer that not referring to any particular organization I've worked with before or been affiliated with. This incorporates sort of an amalgamation of personal experiences or an experience that have been described to me, as well as some case studies and research. So I don't, this is not about any sort of particular organization, but just a general theme that I've looked at and sort of read about in terms of research. So a large grain of salt to be taken in terms of the variance that people can have, because some organizations can be really quite good in terms of inclusivity, and other ones maybe not so good in terms of that spectrum. But
Hmm.
to set the landscape
Yeah.
a little bit and frame a little bit about what some of these experiences are like.
What is good?
Yeah, what is
What
good and
are
what,
the options?
and what does that look like? And I'll be the first person to say that there's no such thing as achieving an ideal. I think it's always a process of becoming and just sort of striving for growth. But to talk a little bit about some of the challenges is that often I feel like, and this has been what's reflected in research, is that it seems like it's a process of reflecting on compromise that people tend to get stuck on. They tend to have a lot of policies that are engaged with organizations to have a lack of clear policy and training among management regarding to what constitutes a helpful or possible or available accommodation, in
Hmm.
addition to how managers should navigate general team dynamics, as well as foster an understanding of neurodiversity across the organization. Frequently, even within sort of mental health organizations, NGOs, governmental roles, as well as community and outreach in schools, you can see sort of an experience of othering or marginalized language being used towards persons with sort of different approach or capacities to different work, whether this is stemming from neurodiversity or even just sort of personality or behavioral differences that occur within people. In addition, I often have like noticed that there's a bit of a constant push and pull dynamic between the desire to like outwardly demonstrate an aura of inclusivity, but then while behind closed doors, middle managers will often directly complain about neurodiverse workers being poor performers or struggling to manage accommodation requests because they aren't sure what they can offer, or they feel like they're caught between workers and upper management, or in some cases, upper management directly advocating for screening out neurodiverse workers because of perceived issues or deficits. So I feel like overall, this can kind of factor into a distinct and targeted experience of feeling less than competent or feeling less able to rectify or discuss these factors, other than approaching it from kind of a deficit focus in the sense of it being like I have to somehow self-disclose a perceived disability and almost in some ways justify why I need an accommodation,
Right.
from again coming from that deficit focus as opposed to it being viewed as sort of a normal variance of human presentation. Have you
Yeah.
experienced anything like that before in your life, or have you noticed something
Absolutely.
similar?
I've been quite the victim of the medical model of psychiatry, and I think for a long time I thought that I was bad. Like, I
Mm,
was a broken person. I was born at the wrong time. Maybe if I could be just like living in a cave somewhere, just doing what I want, then everything would have been fine. Fast forward like 20 years, 30 years, and it's like, actually, you were misdiagnosed the whole time. You're fine, babe. Yeah, we definitely talk about the medical model on this show. I forget what episode it was. Oh gosh, this is terrible of me. See, I have really bad working memory issues. That's just like part of my whole disability.
mm,
I think in some ways, I definitely have struggled with ADHD, like without knowing it. This working memory thing has been terrible my whole life, but it's not something that I could just get better at, or just
mm,
try harder. And so I think really understanding that in later years has been super helpful. Definitely being diagnosed with ADHD helped to heal
mm,
that like broken mindset, because previously I had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder,
mm.
which is like inherently like a mood
Quite stigmatized
disorder.
label.
It's Yeah, totally. I mean, it's yeah. I have heard really good things about Australia actually being the leader now in mental health, like reframing. I mean, obviously the US was on its way and then we just crashed out hard hard this year. But yeah, anyway, I'm
Yeah,
tangenting again. I want to get back to it. Yes, I've definitely had experiences.
yeah.
But I think in a workplace, let's see. Yeah, I never received any kind of accommodations at school, although I will say that we expect our teachers to do a better job with our kids. Like
Mm.
our boss, like we expect our teachers to know what accommodations would work for our neurodiverse kids. So why is that expectation not there for like the grown-ups in our lives? Um,
Yeah, well, that's a really
they make
excellent
way
point.
more money.
Yeah. And so that's also something I was going to touch on later in the sense of going that now it's becoming more prevalent in terms of awareness, in terms of diagnosis, and in terms of
Hmm.
accommodation coming at a lower end of sort of I guess the process coming from sort of elementary school into high school into university into workplace is that workers are going to expect accommodation now because it's something that's been socialized within them.
Yep.
But
But
the
what
one thing
is
that
accommodation? Yeah, who's gonna
yeah,
teach you?
Yeah, exactly. And what does that look like? But we'll get all into that. But the one thing that I really kind of want to highlight is
Mm.
that it's that this lack of clear training or policy frameworks which can occur within the workplace at time is highlighted generally across the spectrum of research. It's not just within one sector or one area. It's across an area, but it's also um, it includes broader levels of kind of poor workplace satisfaction, increased psychological risk, which can be present for both managers and workers, including those that are both neurodiverse and non-neurodiverse workers. When there is a lack of sufficient education and training and inclusivity and accommodations made for neurodiverse workers, because it increases the level of emotional labor that managers feel in terms of trying to manage situations that they don't know how to manage, or how do they manage conflict between perceived differences in accommodation. Why am I offering accommodation to this worker and not that? So
It would be
in
so
some
much
cases
easier
of
if we just let everybody have accommodations.
there you go. Now you're ahead of the curve. That's exactly what I was about to talk about.
Oh,
So
man.
sometimes a resolution can be achieved with organizations having proactive and inclusive management, which includes working towards and offering and discussing a collaborative accommodation for all workers based on individual needs. Why do you need to differentiate it? Because the point of when you start differentiating it, then it becomes the point of when you need to, in some ways, exclude it based on arbitrary criteria or policy. You know,
Yeah,
in
and that
some
puts
ways,
people in that awkward position of having to prove something that's already quite vulnerable to even bring up in the first place.
yeah,
Like, they think we're
absolutely.
out here just lying about our diagnoses, just voluntarily being stigmatized in the workplace just to get what? Flexible time schedule, maybe?
Yeah.
No,
And the
nobody's
irony is,
doing that.
no, and the thing is that their workplaces already generally provide accommodations or variances for a variety level of a variety of more sort of, I suppose, socialized or socially acceptable
Mm,
differences or differences within the home, or for things like, say, for example, spiritual or religious requirements, or people that have parenting requirements, or anything across that kind of spectrum, or people who have been bereaved. We offer these naturally when consider them to be not carte blanche, but something that is readily offered and readily available, and is discussed on, again,
socially acceptable
socially acceptable is a
reasons
good word
for,
for it. Yeah,
I don't know, not grieving. It feels, yeah. Anyway, yeah,
yeah.
interesting.
So the differences is why there and not in other places and that kind of thing. But I won't get too much into that detail. But the biggest thing that I would emphasize is it minimizes the burden sitting with neurodiverse employees having to disclose this disability and to prove that it exists, and that's important because in some ways that is discriminatory and it is othering because they're now facing rejection for having to essentially disclose something that by law they're not obliged to disclose. In addition, it also minimizes the burden of them having to frame or shape this accommodation based on factors that are beyond their knowledge or control, because often the average worker is like, they're not going to be fully aware of what the disability policy is. They don't know what the
Hmm.
budgetary constraints are. They don't know what the environment is with the management in terms of what
They
they're going to
might not
offer and
even
what's
know
not.
what works for them.
They don't, may not even know exactly. So it has to be in some ways a collaborative discussion that's proactively offered and inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if we go back to instead focusing on offering and discussing these collaborative accommodations based on all workers and all individual needs, eliminates the need for us to, in some ways, disclose these disabilities, to self pathologize our own differences, and essentially need to, instead of saying this works, what works best for me, instead, I need to frame it in a way that's a deficit and saying, I really struggle with this, I have a diagnosis for it, and this is why I need this, and please, please, can you give it to me because I'm really struggling right now. Supposed to just saying, this is how I work best. This is what's going to get the best out of me, is if this works in this way, you know? Really shifts that kind of mindset from that deficit focus into something that's a little bit more strengths based, you know? And again, it also inadvertently resolves that kind of debate we a little bit touched on at the start in terms of how do I label myself? What is neurodiversity? What is neuroatypicality? What's included with it? What are the best terms to be used within? What's the value of the label? How is this
Yeah.
conceptualized? If you just offer it and open it to all workers, then it's kind of this thing of where now it's no longer this what is included, what isn't included, what do I need to put within it, what do I not need to do. So it kind of resolves a little bit of also the policy decision making in terms of organizations having to draw a line in the sand in terms of what are we not going to and not going to at some point.
Mm-hmm. Um, I love to borrow a term from like app design, accessibility
Mm,
standards. They use this concept called universal design for
mm,
accessibility standards. And I really love the concept of universal design for accommodations in the workplace. Like, if we just universally design workplaces to be good for brains, if we do that to our schools, our school systems, then we're just going to get naturally better outcomes than we're seeing now. There's research, we know these things, but it's just not like part of the cost benefit analysis usually,
mm.
or at least not, it doesn't get to the right people that can make the decisions
Yeah, that's a really, really
in a
good
way they
point.
understand.
Yeah, in a way that they understand, because I mean, I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, but that the thing is that it actually really ends up saving organizations a lot of money, because it's in terms
In
of, well, let's talk
training
about it now.
costs and turnover
Yeah,
and
yeah. Let's talk about that now.
leave.
And then
Yeah.
we'll go back a little bit. But I think I really like that idea because I imagine it teaches a lot of people self-efficacy in terms of discovering what works for them, what doesn't work for them, which areas, do I need to go sit in this area? Do I need to do this area? And it allows them to sort of have that voice and choice in terms of what they do, which is again a little bit more trauma informed. Having the option to sort of figure out what does and doesn't work for you without it being an arduous process means that you're going to experiment more and know more. You're going to know more about yourself. Because one of the things that kind of comes up a little bit in research and what I was kind of thinking is that, okay, well, let's play a little bit of devil's advocate and think of maybe an organization. They're thinking, oh, we're a bit more pragmatic, quote unquote. Why were we going to do all these considerations and accommodations for such a small portion of the workforce, blah, 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 right? So to
Right.
quote a really good researcher who talks about this, they're Levy. They wrote a good paper in 2023, which I've got a big reference list, which I'm happy to give you to at the end. So without a legal imperative or incentivization in tandem with a lack of resources and neurotypicality in the workplace, organizations may be left to asking questions like, why would we be actively seeking out individuals with quote unquote intellectual disabilities to work in high-level positions? Why would organizations care about neurodiversity and make an essential portion of their
Yeah.
diversity agenda? Now, besides the sort of ethical and legal minefield of that comes with trying to screen out people with hidden disability, which is not great in the first place, but
Yeah.
if we can broadly assume that at any given time, I can only really talk about the stats for Australia, but approximately 1 in 8 Australians employed could be neurodivergent, right? So this is equates to rough levels of prevalence within the population and rough prevalence within employment rates. So this is already present and ubiquitous across your workforce. It cannot be avoided, nor can it be screened out for. And even the screening methodology they would use would be in some ways ineffective, right?
Yeah.
So if we consider more practical considerations of retaining neurodiverse employees, the cost differential between hiring versus retention is exceedingly high. So in some sources, they estimate anywhere between 5,000 US dollars to 14,000 US dollars on actual spend for hiring, but this can escalate to upwards to 3 to 4 times the annual salary of an employee in combination of hard and soft costs. So these are things like productivity loss, morale damage, reputation damage in terms of losing employees, because every time you have an employee quit, the whole team has to compensate for their work and you have to spend additional time hiring. So that productivity loss is costing an organization 3 to 4 times more the annual salary of an employee. So if you're hiring someone in a higher level position, $120,000 a year, something like that. That's like $500,000 nearly. So it's always going to be
Wow.
hiring is always more expensive than retention. Retention and diversity hiring are now a key mission of the Australian Human Rights Commission. In addition, there's now been the inclusion of psychological safety as a factor in occupational health and safety, which is legal law here. So if you don't minimize or mitigate psychosocial risks within the workplace, you're potentially liable. So if active steps are taken or the measures are taken that are
Mm.
tokenistic, as described in sort of the experiences we're talking about before, of where there's an aura of inclusivity, but then managers are actively sort of talking about bad practice behind doors. Right?
Or finding any reason to write you up
Yeah, exactly. It
and then
leaves
get you
the
out.
organization open to both huge profit loss as well as legal and ethical liability. So essentially, it can't be ignored. It can't be screened out. It cannot be avoided when considering an employee's well-being. So there's no practical reason for an organization to be on the back foot when it comes to enhancing its approach towards neurodiverse employees. Yeah. But that begs the question, well, what do we do with that? You know, we've talked a little bit about sort of eliminating the barriers towards seeking accommodation. The other one is we can talk a little bit about modifying the biopsychosocial model in terms of incorporating that within the workplace. There's lots of different levels of combination of models we can apply to conceptualize it in the workplace.
Tell me more about the biopsychosocial thing that's in your laws now, because I have a feeling, we're going to have a period of rebuilding here in the US, and maybe we can use some of your laws as a
Yeah.
blueprint.
Yeah. So biopsychosocial model isn't part of law.
No.
Just to frame it, but it's just a model that we can utilize. So it's often used to conceptualize sort of when we're looking at sort of a more holistic picture of mental health with an individual, but it can also be applied across multiple different settings. So if we're looking at it as a possible approach, in this case, especially when you're talking about policies, it kind of helps with that conceptualization issue and the tensions between that. You're talking a little bit about the medical model of disability, and then we also have sort of the social model. So just to kind of briefly summarize medical model versus social model, you're looking at medical model usually rules the perspectives of workplace accommodation being focused on proving and analyzing behavior versus be a sufficient deficit. So I need to prove sufficient deficit in order to achieve accommodation, whereas a social model of disability is that the underlying tenet of the disability is caused by an environment not being able to accommodate the individual appropriately, right? So it tends to sort of place the burden of emphasis either on the environment or the individual. So the rectification in both of including in some ways that, yes, environment does impact, but then the way that individual approaches the situation does impact as well, is in some ways the bias or psychosocial model. So in the case of what you're looking at with an individual worker, it's essentially a Venn diagram between psychological, biological, and social factors that could be influenced on. So if you were to look at sort of the emergence of the three factors in the middle, so the three key levers that could be affected on within a workplace, within the three bits, we'd be looking at something like job fit, coworker training, potentially medication or something like that, as well as job accommodation. So these are the sort of four major levers that could be utilized. You're looking at more than environmental factors in terms of the social factors. You're looking at like coworker and manager expectations, work environment. You're looking at potential communication issues, stigma that occurs within the workplace, relationship issues, and then identification with disability, right? So it's by looking and conceptualizing these three factors, it allows workplaces to look at and separate out and tease out these key bits and to say, okay, well, what can we work on as an organization? What is our responsibility and how do we foster these inclusive social environments? And then what does the individual have in their level of responsibility in terms of managing it? Because the workplace can't say, for example, control medication usage by an employee that can help them with medication access. But it's something to sort of not necessarily talk to them about, but just something to consider some factors that are within the individual employee's control. And this is kind of I suppose, a bit of a compromise between those two sides and a way of rectifying it, because I can imagine with some organization, it's kind of a bit alien not to include some level of the medical model within it as well. So if eliminating all restrictions and accommodations and applying it to all workers is a little bit too radical, biopsychosocial models towards the middle. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's important to see like what is still within your personal responsibility or like web of control. I don't know, I couldn't think of a better word of. Anyway, it might be medication, it might be meditation. It might be a walk before you go start your day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's multiple ways, and I really like the way that you framed that in terms of web of control or locus of control, and because ultimately it's
I knew that
about
came from somewhere.
yeah, there you go. Ultimately, it's about trying to focus on, like you said, about knowing yourself and knowing what works for you. And I really like what you mentioned before again is about that people often don't know because they're not really given the opportunity to explore that. Or they're not really provided the resources or the support necessary to really explore that in a safe way. And instead, it becomes, again, this kind of stigmatized aspect that needs to either be hidden away or in some ways addressed in a way that is focused. But the more that we sort of focus it as just a variance and that fact that there could actually be benefits in terms of hiring neurodiverse employees. I mean, the same author that I was talking about before, Laferre-Levay, they talk a little bit about how a lot of it is about reframing the strengths that neurodiverse employees can provide in the workplace and looking about sort of workplaces proactively hiring neurodiverse employees and being able to place them in positions that are broadly sort of aligned with their skill sets as well as what works best for them in terms of a work environment in order to maximize productivity in those areas. So as much as I don't want to reduce individuals down just to solely productive workers, again, it goes back to that kind of aspect of in order to meet people halfway, it's about how do we frame accommodations, adjusting workplaces in a way that workplaces are going to understand and businesses are going to understand.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I'm thinking of the old school like job placement tests that they might give to you back in high school to see like what should I do with the rest of my life. I really think we should give those another shot. They weren't good the first time, but maybe we can make them better now because we know more about brains.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is about it's a journey of self-discovery.
We need to make this more efficient because I mean, but yeah, it's self-discovery, but also it's frustrating. I just want to rest. Just tell me what's going to work for me.
Yeah,
I'm a
yeah,
person who forgets a lot and I lose track of time. Just give me a profile of like neurodivergent tools that will help me.
yeah, absolutely.
There's got
No,
to be
no,
an
that's
app for that.
yeah. Yeah. I'm sure someone will develop something with AI these days that will be helpful with that, but that's a whole other can of worms to kind of open in terms of AI in the workplace.
Wow,
Yeah.
you've really hit a lot of your notes here.
Cool.
I think the one thing that you haven't really talked a lot about is yourself, and I don't know
Yeah,
if
sure.
that's intentional.
No, no,
Sorry, I don't know what
I'm
I just.
happy to talk about myself a little bit. Well, I suppose it's like the thing is that I tend to sort of take the perspective of like n equals one when we're talking about research in the sense of like I don't necessarily want to place myself in the center of it because then I'm just talking about my anecdotal experiences as opposed to it being in some ways evidence informed.
Makes a lot of sense. I think what I was so the way I was going to steer this is sort of talk to me about your practice and how yeah, and how you use all of this. I wouldn't say it's different, but it's not controversial. It's like, I don't know, honestly cutting edge. Like you're doing the thing that we're going to be doing in the future
Yeah,
already.
hopefully.
Tell me. It
Um,
feels like it. Yeah.
but that's always the way with research is that most of what you read is it's already 2 to 3 years behind when they actually wrote it and researched it, and then what actually ends up going in industry is often 10 to 20 years behind when this is happening in
Yeah.
research. But there have been sort of broader changes that are moving towards this. But I suppose how this applies in terms of my own individual practice is really to go back to why I wanted to talk about in this first place is so much of what I see when I work with my clients and what I've worked with my supervisees over the years is just trying to feel like they fit in somewhere and trying to feel like they're welcome in a workplace and trying to feel um, as though they know themselves. So that journey of kind of self-discovery, but also balancing that kind of requirement of how do I balance my valuation as a person versus my valuation as a worker. And so to explain a little bit in terms of my like work history, I used to work as sort of a therapist for therapists for a while, and you even see it within the
Mm.
mental health sector a lot. People will often work in our career for 20 or 30 years some ways and aware of how they work with others and in terms of their own ways of working with an organization, whether they're neurodiverse or have certain adverse life experiences or adverse health conditions or just generally sort of in that normal unquote level of variance.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk to them about their experiences in the workplace, it's often comes with a deep level of frustration or sadness with because their concerns don't really feel like they're being taken seriously at times, or they don't feel like people really understand who they are or what their needs are, or they feel like they're constantly compromising their needs for work. So a lot of the work that I do with my clients is really values based. So I'm a cognitive therapist by trade, but I tend to practice sort of third wave behavioral therapy with a lot of ACT, CBT, CT, as well as sort of mindfulness practices and motivational interviewing and that kind of thing. So a big portion of what I try to work on when I'm working with individuals that feel really burnt out at work, feel frustrated with it, is trying to again return to that kind of values based and identities based work of where we try to figure out where are they deriving their value of themselves and that identity of themselves, and how can we in some ways um, demesh it from work. It can be difficult at times when, like I said, you've been working as a therapist for 20 or 30 years, or you've been working as a first responder, and your whole life is your work. And so when even with some cases where clients have had sort of a midlife revelation in terms of their neurodiversity, it can really sort of change the way that they think about themselves, which can lead to this existential crisis. So rather
Yes.
than waxing lyrical about it, but I suppose that my approach is really trying to again de-emphasize that value as a productive worker being your value and as a human being and as a person, because really it's just an aspect of yourself. It's part of yourself as opposed to being your actual self. And being able to really explore to them and return to that kind of values base and trying to think of what is really important to you, what does drive you in your work, what does make you passionate about yourself, but also how do you conceptualize yourself outside of your work and based on your relationships to other people and based on relationships to nature, and nature being sort of a more broader sense, sort of your relationship to objects, what you do in the world, and your day-to-day living, and that kind of thing. So I really try to work with them in that direction, because it allows them to have a sense of stability and security that's outside the chaos of work. Because if we consider, even though we're talking about sort of these adaptive practices that can perhaps be applied at sort of a more policy or workplace level, the individual doesn't have much control of that. So a portion of what I try to do is, one, provide that level of kind of like base of stability and valuation outside of the work identity. But then another part is sort of a bit of a coaching aspect and advocacy work that I tend to do in terms of how do you manage workplace conflict and how do we work towards that? And is there anything I can do in terms of advocating for you towards your workplace in terms of providing you with accommodations? Or how do you navigate through the minefield that can happen when you do ask for accommodations, or when you're, perhaps even a more interpersonal level, navigating a conflict with your boss, which we've all been in with coworkers and bosses.
Been there.
Yeah. Been there. So a big portion is trying to do that, but trying to do it in a way of normalizing it as, again, a process of just being a human and being a human worker, as opposed to catastrophizing it or sort of placing it as a way of, oh, you just need to do whatever your workplace says because it's just, vital to your living or your work or that sort of thing. In some cases, yeah, I mean, you may need to advocate and say, like, look, maybe you can't afford to quit your job at the moment, but what can we do for you in the meantime? What can I do to help you and to make your work-life balance a little bit more manageable and feasible in the short term? But I do think a big portion of it, my role as a counselor is towards social justice and towards advocacy and trying as much as possible. And for me, that tends to come more from that workplace advocacy base. So yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. I think it's absolutely the place of mental health professionals to be sort of in that social justice sphere. Yeah, I mean, I've been in, not to brag or anything, but I've been in therapy for 20 years and it's less about psychoeducation at this point. And it's more about, we need to change material conditions for people and we need to make it not so like healthcare can't be tied to your job, because then you're stuck there. It's like your housing, even stuck to your job. Like if you lose your job, like you lose your housing, that's depressing. That's scary. It doesn't promote that psychological safety that you were talking about earlier. Yeah. The future is,
Yeah. And hopefully changes kind of occur
we
over
know how to
time.
make it better.
Yeah. Yeah. If only people just want to
Let's
listen to
just do
researchers.
it.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
Because it is the difficulty at times in workplace because people just tend to make decisions on vibes. You know what I mean? And sometimes you're like, maybe we shouldn't be making policy decisions based on vibes. You know what I mean? Sometimes in some meetings in past, I'm just like, what are we talking about here? We maybe just do a little bit of research. Hire someone to do a bit of research. Let's speak to a peak body that actually does this for a living and people who are professional advocates.
And then we'll just ignore them because we don't like what they've told us.
It happens sometimes, but it's the biggest way that if I was to say to any sort of manager or any sort of policy decision maker is there's a really good quote from Marcus Aurelius, which I will try to say. Not that I would say I'm a Stoic by any means. I believe a variety of philosophies, but really good quote from Marcus Aurelius, which is the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. So when you find yourself becoming, and this is really good for like also clinicians who struggle with counter, transference or anything we're talking about in terms of when you feel a strong emotional response, when you're experiencing a life difficulty, anything like that, it is recognizing that the obstacle has to in some ways become the way. So if you find yourself oppositional in a workplace, when you're looking at these accommodations, when you're looking at helping people that are neurodiverse and you feel in some ways it's compromising something or it doesn't quite work towards what you're doing or you feel frustrated for it, think about it in the sense of being non-adaptive in this process is not going to help you in the long term. It's not going to help your organization in the long term. And it's just going to lead to this reoccurrence of this feeling of oppositional and obstacle natures. Instead, it's about taking a step back and trying to understand, well, why is this occurring? Why do I feel this way? What do we need to, in some ways, change for this to cease to becoming an obstacle? So the way that what stands in the way becomes the way. So how do we work and refer to those as peer experts in lived experience as a way of directing us towards how we provide these accommodations or how we make these policy changes. So things like reference groups can be really, really helpful, or just even emphasizing lived experience as a level of expertise in the workplace, as opposed to it being, I've worked in a number of industries, and sometimes people will just be like, oh, I'm a psychologist, I know what I'm doing, or I'm a this and that, or I've been a PhD. And it's like, well, we're all we're experts in some areas, but not experts in all areas. I would never say that I'm an expert in someone's life or know what's best for them to any degree, or I would
The
never.
meritocracy is a bit out of hand, if you ask me. But
Yeah.
what do I know? I'm just a mom.
Yeah, I'm just a mom. Yeah. Well, it's that kind of thing, right? It kind of reaches a point of where it's just like at some point, intellectual humility will get you further. And this is something that even in my own life that I've struggled with at times. It's our egos can be a little bit of a defense mechanism, and we're just like, oh, I need to sound like an expert in the moment. It's like I'm kind of a non-expert. It's more about leaning into it, which again is why I wanted to sort of have this be a little bit more evidence informed. Why I spent a lot of time sort of doing a bit of research in this today, because again, if there was
I
just to
can
talk about
tell you're speaking extremely formally. And yeah, so I can just tell that there's been some actual study here. You sound way smarter than me right now, and that is not typical, friend.
That's okay. I tend to find that the biggest thing that I've learned in life is just to try to advocate for yourself as much as possible and know where your line is, especially when it comes to workplaces. I was talking a more personal example.
What do you mean by
is
that?
just so know when you're going to sort of decide when to take certain actions. So the biggest thing that I tend to advocate, especially if I'm working with people in difficult workplaces, is always know where your line is. Know when you've had enough, or know when you can make alternative decisions and plan for them as well. So to be a little bit more opportunistic, because often what people will do is they'll believe a bit of some cost fallacy in terms of their workplace. They'll say, no, I've been there for this long and that long, but the thing is when it stops serving you, what does it serve, and who is it serving in that moment, right? So at some point, you do have to kind of take a step back and sort of think to yourself, well, where is that line, and what will that look like, and how will you know when that's crossed? And you can have multiple lines. For some people, it's kind of like a traffic light system. I've got a green, I've got a yellow, I've got a red. When it goes over the red line, maybe I need to start looking for a new job. And for other people, it's just one big red line once that line gets crossed. And I'm not trying to say that you have to do it, or I'm going to hold you accountable, or I'm going to hold myself accountable. There is, of course, flexibility, but at the same time, if you don't know when that line is, then usually what happens is total collapse. You wait until the last possible moment is when you're going through complete adverse conditions, or you totally collapsed and you're completely struggling, and that's only when you quit. And then you basically have to build yourself back up again.
Yeah.
You're going
you have
from
to safety plan when you're not in crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Otherwise, your plan sucks. No, your options are limited at that point because you're already actively in crisis. Sorry, that's like victim blamey.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. I mean, look, let's just be rational. When you're in crisis, you're not thinking straight. You're not really kind of making the greatest decisions. And so maybe your choices are going to suck. It doesn't mean it's your fault that they suck. It just means that maybe they're going to be non-optimal choices. But definitely it is preferred to safety plan. But at times, when you're not in crisis, at times you just make do with what you have based on circumstances.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be really intricate either. I have a client who, she knows that if she ever breaks down crying over work, she's done.
Yeah.
We've sort of talked about it. She's sort of in that yellow stage where she's looking for jobs. She's not working, but she's not really serious about it. But once those tears start flowing, she's out of there. And so that's all it's got to be,
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's about big portion of exploring what that is for people because it gives them a sense of control as well in an environment they often feel like they have no control over. And again, I really liked how you brought up sort of that balance and that struggle at times that can occur when we're clinicians about, we don't want to put too much emphasis on the individual, or we as described it kind of victim blaming there because it can feel like we're adversely judging someone or placing them in a position of power when they don't have much power. But at the same time, a big portion of our job is like skills development and helping people with it, help navigate difficult environments. And of course, when that can be, sort of working from a direct level and saying, okay, well, you're having an interpersonal conflict. Let's help resolve that. Or you're struggling to advocate for your needs or to say no at work. Okay, let's work on your boundaries and let's do a little bit of work there. So, it's a balance at times, but at the same time, it always returns back to that there is a level of individual responsibility when we approach any situation, because otherwise it just becomes like, I can't do anything and, I have no control and learn helplessness. That doesn't help anyone anyway. So it's a balance.
I know. I've always really hated the rhetoric that like you're the only one who's in control of your thoughts and feelings, and it's like, well, yeah, kind of.
Yeah, yeah, kind of. It's a balance. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is a balance. It's like you might not be able to control the initial impulse or instinct even is a
Mm.
better word for it, but you choose to re-engage with that and keep it alive or not.
That's a really good way of putting it. So the way that they describe that in Buddhist philosophy is
35 years in the making.
yeah, it's
Tell
it's called
me.
the second arrow. Have you ever heard of that analogy before? So the first arrow is the reaction or the experience that you have. And then the second one is your observation or reaction to your reaction. So often we can't
Mm,
control the first reaction that we have, the first impulse, as you put it, or the first behavior that occurs. The only thing that we can control in some ways is our observation or a judgment of that behavior, because otherwise it just cascades. So we call this like sort of like metacognition in
that's
CBT.
amazing. It's so frustrating to me how I can't have a single unique thought or idea. Like, for example, in the past, I thought I came up with tarot therapy. Like,
Yeah.
but then I learned about Carl Jung and how it was already an entire discipline, and I was like, "Ugh, gosh, can't I have anything?" No.
Yeah. But that's the brilliance of both
That's
humanity
so
is that
funny.
we're both unique and individual at the same or individual and collective is a better way of putting it. Is that generally we all come up with the same kind of ideas, or the same ideas are going to be conceptualized, but at the same time they're also applied in unique ways.
That's
And
so beautiful. I
so,
wasn't expecting to cry this conversation. No, it's okay, it's gone already. I've gotten really good at that. Like, I'll get, like, the tears, and then, there's, like, tingling in my nose, um, and then it washes away.
yeah, but it's okay to cry. I mean, I'm glad that this has been an impactful conversation for you, and it's been really enjoyable having with you. And I appreciate you bringing me on and then letting me talk about this because I could essentially talk about this all day. So it's been a really good experience, and it's been really good chatting to someone who's had similar experiences as myself, because it can feel isolating at times, being neurodiverse and having, yeah, feeling like you said that when you said about feeling broken or feeling bad, it's definitely a theme that occurs in a lot of people's lives, whether they're neurodivergent a lot or not. And even though I folks say again it's a variance, but um, it's really important, and that's really sort of what I would say is my key goal as a therapist, is to really work through that with my clients, because it's ubiquitous across working with a lot of clients, that feeling of being different or being wrong or being bad. And I don't think it's something that anyone should really ever feel, um, in terms of feeling that sort of level of brokenness. At least not in the long term. Can't always control short term experiences, but in the sense of, I wouldn't want them to adopt it as a core sort of belief about themselves, because it's fundamentally not true. For so many people, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I feel like I was a little bit harsh on therapy today. I definitely wouldn't be here, I think, without the experiences that I had in therapy.
Mm,
even the negative ones, even the doctors who didn't get it right still taught me something about myself.
Yeah.
And so in hindsight, I can say that and be okay with it. But also, like I was starting to say, I've had some really positive experiences. I think learning about ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy was really, really important for me. CBT,
I mean, it's the best way I would
because it was
describe.
just like, well, yeah, I can convince myself that I can gaslight myself too.
I think the best way I would sort of describe, especially CBT, when it comes to neurodiverse persons, is that if it's not adapted correctly, it's and generally is found to be unhelpful. So,
Yeah,
which is
and I think
generally
it's
how it's
because
described.
we have such complex inner worlds. Is that right? Like
Yeah,
we're
it can
so
be.
different.
I think it's also because it's about if you're giving someone essentially like homework for someone who is already struggling to fill out paperwork and documentation and not wanting to fill out document. I'm wondering what is the purpose of that?
Uh,
And
I never
also,
got homework.
yeah, well, and also it's also the aspect of where it's if we're not explaining sort of a non-individualized kind of purpose for doing cognitive behavior therapy, and we're instead just focusing on constantly challenging our thoughts, I wonder what the value of that is at times because it has to be in some ways incorporated and integrated into other forms of therapy. So primarily I incorporate
Yeah,
it
you
from a
have to learn
humanistic
how to make
perspective.
decisions.
Yeah, yeah. So being like rational and challenging some of our thoughts sometimes is helpful, but constantly feeling like you need to challenge every thought or it's all just about thought challenging, I don't think that's a really
Mm,
helpful aspect. You know what I mean? Because it
yes.
fundamentally undermines why we're challenging the thoughts in the first place. It's not to change the thought, it's to change the beliefs of how we believe about ourselves. So if we're not really focusing on that, then what are we really focusing on? Like you said, it just becomes a little bit like gaslighting. We're just kind of going, okay, well, don't think about that. Let's think about this. Don't think about this. Let's think about that. At what point does that really helpful? I imagine that we feel quite stressful and sort of stifling at times. Or it felt like
Mm,
that's the obligation that's required of us.
yeah, especially like you said, if it's the only tool that you can reach for, that's not great. So if you're listening and you have a therapist that doesn't like feel like a good fit, maybe they're giving you homework and that's not your jam. Maybe they're not really like maybe it feels like they don't really listen to you. Like you've
Mm.
said something and then they make a suggestion that's not applicable or maybe even something that you already said you don't want. It's totally okay to just challenge that person and say like,
Oh, yeah.
"Hey, um, no."
I'd say the best thing is just to talk to them about it. Or what I invite my clients to do is I say, if you think I'm full of shit, just tell me I'm full of shit. You know what I mean? It's the best thing to do is just encourage open and direct and honest conversation between yourself and the client. And if your therapist isn't doing that, if they feel challenged by your challenge, I'd wonder again, how is that serving you? Because at the end of the day, it's about your experience, your needs in this moment. And if they can't rationalize or really discuss why they're doing their approaches or it hasn't been collaborative with you, then really how much of it is their perspective versus yours, you know what I mean? Not that you want to place
Mhm.
it as oppositional, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Where can people find you on the internet?
the best way to find me is either on LinkedIn. So you got my name right there at the bottom. Otherwise,
Yes.
if you go to walktalkcounseling.com, that's counseling with a U. Just walktalkcounseling.com. That'll be my website there, and you can reach out to me there. But otherwise, feel free to reach out to me at LinkedIn or its email is matt@walktalkcounseling.com.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. If you want to connect with the Neurodivergent Report, you can find us at ND Report Pod on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, Substack, etc.
If you're looking to support the show, the best thing you can do is subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. Please do that.
And hey, if you want to check out more about us, visit our website at ndreportpod.com. And you can also go there if you want to be a guest contributor on the show.
Until next time, be well, do good.